In this lesson, I'll talk about why you should build a virtualization lab at all. What are the limitations to a virtualization lab, whether or not you should use physical servers, the importance of shared storage, and then I'll show you step by step how to run VMware vSphere in VMware Workstation. So with that, let's get started. Why should you build a virtualization lab at all? Well, the first reason, of course, is to learn virtualization firsthand. It's one thing to watch it in a video or to read a book about it, but it's much different and much more educational to do it for yourself. But you don't have to spend $10,000 to do that. Building a virtualization lab can be really inexpensive and really not as hard as you might think, and that's what I'll show you in this lesson. By building the lab, you'll also prove that virtualization works as advertised. It's great to hear from other people who have used it, but it's completely different to do it for yourself and see it with your own eyes. You'll be able to prove that virtualization works for your company's applications. You can even do a P2V conversion and actually convert one of your physical servers into a virtual server and run it in the lab to see that your company's apps work for yourself, and even show your boss, show your coworkers. And then finally, you should build a virtualization lab to prepare for a virtualization certification so that you have that hands-on knowledge. There's really two different ways to build a virtualization lab. The first way is to build a virtual virtualization lab using something like VMware Workstation. The second way is to build a physical virtualization lab. And I know this can get a little confusing. Let's start with number one, the virtual virtualization lab. So really what this would be to take your existing desktop or laptop computer that has a VT-capable CPU and plenty of RAM to load up VMware Workstation, which is a Type 2 hypervisor, into your existing operating system running on your computer. So, for example, if you're running Windows 7, you would load VMware Workstation on that, and then you would build your virtual lab by creating virtual machines that run VMware ESXi, VMware vCenter, and perhaps even a virtual storage appliance or a VSA. So most people build, let's say, 2 ESXi servers and a Windows 2008 server that runs VMware vCenter. So you have a total of 3 virtual machines running VMware Workstation on your existing computer. So that's how you build a virtual lab using something like VMware Workstation. And this may seem like the utopian perfect scenario, but there are a number of limitations to this, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Now, if you have some room for physical servers and you have some more money and you'd like some higher performance and more dedicated hardware, then option number 2 is to build a physical virtualization lab. So you get a couple servers. It doesn't have to be 4 servers like you see in the picture there. It could be just a couple servers that you use to build your physical virtualization lab. The picture that you see there of the physical virtualization lab is actually my lab from a couple years ago. Back when I took a snapshot of it, I had 2 Dell T610 servers, and then I had a shuttle, small, just Windows 2008 server. Then I had my workstation on the right-hand side, which was just what they call a white box PC, just a generic PC that I would use to run the vSphere client, to administer my lab, and to record my videos. On the left-hand side there's a UPS battery backup in case the power goes out, so I don't lose my work. So that was my physical virtualization lab. The 2 Dell servers ran VMware ESXi, and the small shuttle server on top ran Windows Server 2008 with VMware vCenter server inside. With a physical virtualization lab like that, I could do just about anything I want. I could test just about any VMware virtualization product or Microsoft virtualization product that's available today. There's many fewer limitations and you're going to get much better performance. On the other hand, a lab like that might cost you, say, between $3,000 and $5,000. So those are the 2 different ways to build a virtualization lab. Now let's talk about the limitations to using a virtual virtualization lab. The first one, of course, is that the CPU on your desktop or laptop computer must be a 64-bit CPU with Intel VT or AMD V enabled. You'll need at least 4 gigabytes of RAM, although you could run a single ESXi server in less than that. To really make this a useful lab, you'll need 4 gigabytes or more. I would recommend as much RAM on your server as you can get. That's because every virtual machine you create is going to use up more and more of that RAM. Now, you could do this with VMware ESXi and vSphere, but I can tell you up front it won't work with Hyper-V. Hyper-V still must run on a physical server, so you're going to have to opt for a physical virtualization lab if you want to learn about Hyper-V. Now, you won't be able to power on a 64-bit virtual machine inside your virtualized ESXi server. So that's called a nested virtual machine, and the limitation is you can't have nested 64-bit virtual machines. So I know this is a little confusing because you have your host operating system, say it's Windows 7, you have VMware Workstation underneath that, you create a VMware ESXi virtual machine, which is 64-bit, you can power that on, and then you'll create a virtual machine inside the ESXi server. And that virtual machine, all the way inside the ESXi server, 2 layers of virtualization deep, can only be a 32-bit virtual machine. You could create a 64-bit virtual machine, but you won't be able to power it on. You can only power on 32-bit virtual machines. And that's one of the major limitations of creating a virtualization lab, is you won't be able to power on any 64-bit virtual machines. In fact, even powering on nested virtual machines inside those ESXi servers, you're going to find out that those will run really slow no matter how much hardware you throw at those virtual machines. VMware's fault tolerance feature may not work when you're using a virtualization lab. That's because it's very hardware specific. And then finally, performance may suffer. I mean, you're trying to do so much with your existing desktop or laptop system. Even if you upgrade the RAM and you have a really beefy desktop or laptop system, you're trying to run multiple virtual machines that are very resource intensive on that one system. So just keep that in mind. It's a great low-cost option. It's portable. You could put it on a laptop. You could take it with you on the road. You could demo virtualization. You don't have to spend a lot of money on servers, which take up a lot of room, which create a lot of heat and use a lot of electricity. On the other hand, it's going to be lower performance. So just have those expectations up front when you start creating your virtualization lab. Now, if you opt to use physical servers, even if you are just going to get one dedicated server and then use that to build a virtualization lab on, you really have 2 options for those physical servers. You could use a white box server, which really is just a generic server that you built yourself or you had someone build for you. If you use a white box server, chances are you'll get more value for your money, so you'll get a higher performance system, let's say, for perhaps less money. But on the other hand, that white box server isn't going to be on the VMware or Microsoft hardware compatibility list, so you take the chance of, let's say, getting that server put together and then the network interface card or the storage controller doesn't work. You have to take those back, return them, get some different models that do work. I've had those problems myself with white box servers, and those are just the risks you take by building your own system or having it built for you, with the flip side being that you're going to get more performance for your money. Option 2 is to get a name brand server, and if you're doing that, very likely it will be on the hardware compatibility list, but you do need to check those lists, make sure that that server with its specific CPU and hardware interface cards are on the hardware compatibility list, and then also make sure that that server is even compatible with specific features. For example, there are servers that are on VMware's hardware compatibility list that aren't compatible with VMware fault tolerance. So if you want to use fault tolerance or test it in your lab, then you'll need to make sure that that model of server supports VMware fault tolerance, as well as being on the hardware compatibility list. Now let me throw up a warning about the importance of shared storage. Shared storage is very important to a virtual infrastructure. That's typically where the virtual machines are stored, and it allows many of the advanced features of virtualization to be possible. If you're building a virtualization lab, very likely you would have some sort of low-end storage area network or network-attached storage appliance. You could also have a server that you turned into a NAS, or you could even use a virtual storage appliance, which is just a virtual machine that simulates a storage area network. So there's 3 different options for shared storage. Having a dedicated hardware appliance, like a low-end SAN or NAS, is going to be the best performance, but it's also going to cost more than, let's say, a virtual storage appliance. Now, it's unlikely that you need shared storage if you just have one ESX, ESXi, or Hyper-V server. But as soon as you go beyond one server, you're going to want to start using features like vMotion, live migration, and VMware High Availability. And when you get to that point, you're going to want shared storage. This is the shared storage appliance that I have in my lab. This is an Iomega IX4 200D. There is even a smaller model called an IX2, but I recommend the IX4 because it has space for 4 drives. Both of these models offer iSCSI storage area network and NFS NAS connectivity, to a VMware or Hyper-V virtual infrastructure. And while Iomega has a number of larger models than this, this model I would say should work fine for most virtual infrastructure labs, and it runs between $500 and $800 US. This is the web interface for my Iomega IX4. This is what I've used to configure the IX4 to be both a Windows file share for all my Windows files, and then also an iSCSI storage area network and an NFS network attached storage, or NAS, server. So I can connect my ESXi servers to the Iomega shared storage, both with iSCSI or NFS. And this is a requirement because VMware ESXi can't store virtual machines on a standard Windows file share. You have to have either iSCSI, NFS, or fiber channel storage to store virtual machines using ESXi and take advantage and test all those advanced features such as vMotion, Storage vMotion, VMware High Availability, and DRS. Another option for shared storage is to use the free and open source OpenFiler. This is a Linux-based variant that they've turned into an open source storage appliance software solution. It's completely free. You could install it on an existing physical server, of course, wiping out whatever operating system was on there, and turn that server into a storage server. That would be one low-cost option for creating your shared storage. It provides NFS, iSCSI, and even Windows file shares. You can also use OpenFiler and install it inside a virtual machine to create an OpenFiler virtual storage appliance. A third option is to use the free EMC Solera Uber VSA. You can find this over at Nikipedia.com, or you can Google Solera Uber VSA. And this is actually a virtual appliance you would import into your VMware virtual infrastructure, and then right there you've got immediately iSCSI or NFS storage area network connectivity to store your virtual machines. And if you're wanting to get familiar with EMC management software, the Solera Uber VSA works just like the physical Solera EMC storage area network array. So this is a great way to get experience with that type of high-end storage area network, completely free and completely virtualized. Now we're to the point of this lesson where I show you how to create a virtualization lab by running VMware vSphere inside Workstation. What I'll use to demonstrate this is VMware Workstation version 7, the latest version to this date, with VMware ESXi version 4.1 running inside as a virtual machine. My host operating system is Windows 7, and this is actually a laptop computer with an Intel 64-bit CPU that has VT enabled in the BIOS. The specific CPU model is an i7-2630QM that runs at 2 GHz. You don't have to have that specific CPU to do it, as long as it's a 64-bit CPU with Intel VT or AMD-V. I have 6 gigs of RAM in this laptop system, and it works quite well to run 2 to 3 virtual machines. You should note that VMware Workstation now supports running ESX and ESXi as a virtual machine, and you no longer have to edit the virtual machine configuration files like you'll find in many blog posts on the internet, and even some of the previous videos that I've done that are still posted on the internet that show how to run ESX inside Workstation. Thanks to the support of running ESXi inside Workstation by VMware, doing this is much easier than in the past. Now let me connect over to the laptop where I'll be demonstrating this. Here I am on the laptop system that I'm going to turn into a virtual VMware vSphere lab. So I've already loaded up VMware Workstation. It is available in a 60-day evaluation version, so you can do that for free for 60 days. I've already downloaded VMware vSphere, which includes VMware ESXi and the vCenter server. VMware ESXi is the much more tricky thing that normally runs, of course, on a physical server. That's because it's the hypervisor that you would normally install instead of, let's say, the Windows Server 2008 operating system. vCenter, on the other hand, is just a Windows application and a SQL Server Express database that runs inside Windows Server 2008. So here I've created a virtual machine where I'm actually installing Windows Server 2008. And from there, I'll install vCenter inside. The thing that I really want to show you, though, is how to use VMware Workstation to create an ESXi server virtual machine. That's because, of course, that's the thing that's normally difficult to virtualize, or there's a lot of questions and people have a lot of issues around virtualizing it. But VMware Workstation version 7 works very well to do it. What I'm going to do is just to create a new virtual machine here, and I'm going to even create a typical virtual machine. I'm not going to go through the custom configuration. The installer disk in my case is actually an ISO that I downloaded from VMware.com. I'll click Browse here, and here's the ISO, VM Visor Installer version 4.1. Notice it's 64-bit ISO file, and if I show the details here, you can actually see it's really only 300 megabytes. ESXi is really very tiny compared to this Windows Server 2008 DVD right here. That's 2.6 gigs. So we're going to mount this ISO here. I'll click Next, and then this is going to be a VMware ESX. Now, whether it's ESX or ESXi, it doesn't matter. Just choose ESX Server version 4. That's the only option there. I'll click Next. We'll call this ESXi 4.1, and I'll call this Server 1 in case I have multiple. I'll click Next here. We'll set the maximum disk size at 40 gigs, which is the default. It's fine. We'll store it as a single virtual disk image, and it's actually going to be a thinly provisioned virtual disk. Let's go in here and customize the hardware. Now, we don't need the floppy drive. We'll remove that. Let's go ahead and bridge the network, although that's not really required. We'll remove the USB. I wanted to double check the memory here. 2 gigs should be fine, but let's go ahead and up it to 2.5 gigs. I'll say OK there and click Finish. All right, and we just created our first ESXi virtual machine, and immediately it didn't find the ISO, but I'm going to press Control-Alt-Insert here to reboot. I'll press Escape for the boot menu. We'll go down here and select the CD-ROM. That's because the CD-ROM wasn't highest there on the BIOS boot menu. We'll select the CD-ROM, and it looks like we're having a little trouble reading it. Let's go back here and double check the settings for the virtual machine. I'm going to power it off. Let's edit the virtual machine. Go to the CD ISO. It is connected right there. That's very important. Let's go ahead and use legacy emulation. I'll say OK. Let's power it back on now. And here we go. We just booted up our ESXi ISO image. I'm going to go ahead and select the ESXi installer. This will take us through the normal ESXi installation process. And from here, you're just installing ESXi just like you would on a physical server. Now, over in my Train Signal vSphere video training course, I go into a lot more detail and I spend a lot more time in this. But because this is a much more abbreviated introduction to virtualization course, I'm not going to go into all the details on ESXi installation because honestly, I could turn this into an hour-long video. So let me pause the recording and I'll be right back as soon as I've got the ESXi server installed and running. And there we go. My first VMware ESXi virtual machine has been created. We've virtualized our hypervisor and we're running it inside Workstation as a virtual machine. Now, how about this? What if you want a second one? All we have to do is power this off, go over here and right-click on it, and choose to make a clone of this virtual machine. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to power off this virtual machine, clone it, complete the installation of Windows Server 2008 on my vCenter virtual machine, install vCenter, and then I'm going to come back and demonstrate for you my new VMware vSphere virtual infrastructure running inside VMware Workstation. Okay, I'm back and I've completed the installation of my VMware vSphere Virtual Lab running inside VMware Workstation. Starting on the left-hand side here, I created a Windows 2008 virtual machine that runs VMware vCenter. It's got a local SQL Express database that was installed with the vCenter installation. This is the 60-day evaluation version of vCenter, so it didn't cost me anything. Moving on, I've got an ESXi server, also part of the 60-day evaluation version of vSphere. I've got that up and running. It's called ESXi number 1, and it's got 2 gigs of memory allocated. I've also got a second ESXi server which I really just cloned from the first one, and then I changed the IP address so I didn't have to perform the installation over again. Cloning is a very cool feature of VMware Workstation. Finally, I created a fourth virtual machine that's still running Windows Server 2008. Actually, I cloned that VMware vCenter virtual machine before I installed vCenter, again, so that I didn't have to reinstall Windows Server 2008. This is my Windows Active Directory domain controller and DNS server. And while this virtual machine wasn't completely required, it does give my VMware Virtual Lab a much more realistic enterprise feel and full functionality because I've got an Active Directory domain and I've got a real DNS server. This is completely portable here, these 4 virtual machines, so even if I was on an airplane, I could be using Windows Active Directory, DNS, vCenter, and my 2 ESXi servers, and I could test functionality of, let's say, third-party applications that work in the virtual infrastructure. I can create virtual machines. I can power on 32-bit virtual machines, but not 64-bit virtual machines. You can't run double-nested 64-bit virtual machines, whether you're using Workstation or whether you're running ESX inside ESX on a physical server. Still, I could power on a 32-bit virtual machine, but I'm really starting to push the limitations of this laptop. This laptop just has 6 gigabytes of RAM, and I've allocated 2 gigs to each of the ESXi servers, that's 4, and then another 1 gig and 1 gig to each of the Windows 2008 servers. So I've just about maxed out this laptop, and the performance is starting to get a little sluggish, but it's still useful. And actually, I installed the vSphere client. Let's go over to that right down here, and I connected to my vCenter server. I created a data center, a virtual data center. I added my 2 ESXi servers. And here you can see the manufacturer of the ESXi server is VMware. That's how you can tell that it's actually a virtual ESXi server. It's running on the VMware Virtual Platform is the model of the server. Normally this would look like, let's say, Dell or HP. And if it was a Dell, let's say a Dell T710 physical server. It's got 2 virtual CPUs, but the ESXi server doesn't actually know those are virtual CPUs. And this is the actual CPU model of the CPU on my laptop. We've got 2 gigs of RAM allocated to this ESXi server. And as you can see, I created a virtual machine underneath each of these ESXi servers, but I haven't yet powered on these virtual machines. I am using the 60-day evaluation version of vCenter and ESXi, which is part of the total vSphere evaluation that's available over at VMware.com. Alright, so that's the overview of my virtual VMware vSphere lab running inside VMware Workstation on my laptop.